Okay, here's something that ties in with a goal of self-awareness and self-mapping and good communication. I think one of the most difficult aspects of growing, doing inner work, developing as an individual is accurate mapping in a culture that persists in a willful ignorance of inner studies. And so what we have here is a way of tracking a number of the things that I think are important. Now, a number of cultures have emphasized the idea that within a given personality, we have numerous personas, numerous faces, and this is easy and obvious to see. We've all had that experience of going along in one persona, like a light-hearted party persona, and then an X walks in where there's unresolved issues. Or we're this way at work and then we get home in a different setting and a whole new part of us emerges. You may also have noticed that this happens with different people in your life. That when you're with one person, you're really funny and you're very comfortable. When you're with another person, you may be more tender and gentle. When you're with yet another person, you may be quite sociopathic. And the question is, where are these different personas coming from? And so we do have a core and essential self, a part of us that stays constant within any of the mixes of personas that we develop. And the personas that we develop have a lot to do with the pain-reward cycles in their environment. For example, when I dated a woman who absolutely adored my cooking, I developed all new recipes. I got quite into cooking. I really enjoyed developing unique recipes for her. And, in a kite surfing environment, there's a different persona, a different personality. In a business persona, we naturally adapt to the norms that are put forth in our culture about business, not talking about personal feelings. Why? It's just not done in business because it's built on a supposition that both people are there to exchange money more than other things. But that's a very unique environment. It's a very unique set of looking at things to say that I'm more interested in doing money, exchanging money than I am in you as a human being. And so that persona is a different persona that you might have with family, friends, or at church. So I've left this blank because part of the reason that we're so unconscious is the friction between going from what's going on inside and having an answer. Well, in our culture, we're relatively illiterate about the psyche and our own inner world. It takes a lot of effort to just make a grid to know what to pay attention to. There are so many things going on inside. And so in a mapping experience, I wanted to create a template to see, to allow me to map different things at different times and then erase the details or have it easily repeatable. And so this is a black magnetic blackboard. And in this case, I've just clipped it onto with a little bit of fish line to my larger blackboard that I use for a lot of videos because I wanted it to be something that I could put up and remove. But I also wanted it to be something that couples could use and that I could use to connect in with myself around certain situations. And so if I take, for example, and I'll just use something that's going on personally. Let's take my persona about buying a car. because we're looking at buying an electric vehicle. We'd narrowed it down between a Tesla Model S, a Tesla Model 3, a BMW i3. And there's a couple of other options, but the BMW i3 seems to be the best one. So let's pick that as this green persona here. And so one of the things that I might ask around this issue is, for my persona buying the car, how old do I feel? Emotionally. So this gets into inner age. And so this whole ring here is kind of like it's a quarter of a tree trunk. And I like that analogy because each year that we grow older, we have the memory, the knowledge, the experience from all of the younger years. We have the feelings of the younger years, but we also have a new year, meaning as a tree grows bigger, it contains everything that's there before, and everything that's there before gives it its strength. That which is most new and alive on the cambium is always very fragile. That's where the life is. But it's the dead areas, the bits that have become rigid somewhat in the past, that give the tree its strength, why it doesn't fall over. And one could say the same, that who we are today and what we're growing into may be somewhat tender and uncertain. But it is the past experiences that we've had that have given us a lot of the solidity. So if I look at my car buying experience, my emotions around the car, I'd say 30 years old. So I've got a 30-year-old kind of mindset around this car. And that's the interesting thing with different personas. You'll often notice with lover personas that as a relationship gets intimate, some of the ages are very young. And so while it seems like a 30-year-old me is most engaged with the car, if I did a lover persona, it might be a younger age, depending on the situation. So we've got this dynamic of 30 years of age, and if we look at the traumatic element, because many of us have some degree of unresolved trauma that plays a role in the decision. And so the first thing I would say is of the fight, flight, freeze, I'm a little bit more in fight mode around this, in terms of my temperament to, not be ripped off, not waste a lot of money, etc., is more in the fight mode of fight, flight, freeze. I'm a little bit closer on the sociopathic than the empathic continuum, because I'm paying cash and it's tying up money. I'm focused on safety and more than I'm focused on empathy with the seller or with my wife. I'm relatively grounded. And I'm also, I would say, somewhat fragmented, meaning there's one part of me that just wants to delay and delay the purchase until there's more certainty or a better price or something. So I'm a little bit more fragmented. There's also this desire to take action. So there's a little bit of a division, and there is some degree of compulsiveness, some degree of proactivity. So I'd say I'm in the middle there. And if I look at, I would say that the needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this doesn't feel like a survival issue. There's some sense of security, meaning one thought going through my mind is that, from going from a one-car house to a two-car house, if my car breaks down, I've got some competence, some other options, etc. There's also a sense of self-love and self-esteem. it's just the part of me that likes being helpful. In this case, I'm helping my wife, get a car for herself. So there's a certain sense of enjoying being the good friend in the relationship. I would say that my body, so we're going to continue with extra magnets here, since I've run out of green. So this is the first time I've used this board for anything, and the goal is to kind of give a multidimensional picture of a given item, both to be seen, like one can do this about a marriage or a traumatic event, but also to see oneself. So I would say that my body is let's just do yellow. Let's do green and yellow as one. Or maybe green and clear. So I'd say my body is the most engaged of heart, mind, and body. And my body is carrying some tension. And so that's where I would say that the compulsiveness is. And if I look at my feelings, there's some joy, there's some confidence, there's some enthusiasm, there's also some fear, and there's also some jealousy, which relates to the jealousy relates to it comes up at times for me when I'm doing something for somebody else that no one in my life has done for me. And so in that gap, I'm going out ahead of something that I've personally experienced as a generosity coming towards me. And so there's a little bit of sense like, well, why didn't I get that? And so there's some of that, the sting that, because one way, particularly that the inner child interprets these kinds of things, is if so-and-so gets that, that must mean they're better than me because I didn't get that. And so that's the child. And so that part might be in the, maybe, I don't know, the 3-year-old to 6-year-old, in that range there. There's some sense, we'll go into the purples now, we're just pretending these are all greens, so what I'm learning is that I need more of these pins for one color if I want to map multiple items on a single board to say, well, here's where I am with this one, because then you can place different colors on all of these and it becomes a more dynamic board. So there's some happiness. So some self-pity, the self-pity the happiness is around growing in strength and value. The self-pity, my wife is leaving a lot of this up to me, and so there's a part of me that feels like if anything goes wrong, it'll be my fault. Like if we get the car and 2 weeks later it turns out it needs a $3,000 repair, there'll be a part that feels like it's all my fault because she didn't make the decision. And so there's some self-pity about that. So these are kind of the feelings. And in terms of the childbirth, the adult dying, adolescent maturing, I'd say this is probably an adolescent thing. It's fun to have independence. In terms of my masculine feminine balance, it's definitely on a more masculine continuum for me in terms of speaking, giving, leading, initiating, plans, functionality. There's some listening, but it's not as strong. just because, my wife is kind of pushing that back in my court. And I noticed when I was placing an offer on a car today, there was some sense of holding as opposed to breathing about it. So some holding. I'd say I'm more in the past than in the present or future in my feeling. The kind of feeling of scarcity, I would say, is in the past. Relatively proactive on the reactive-proactive scale. And emotionally, I'm very self-focused and mentally quite other-focused. But let's do the emotional. I'm definitely not bored. I'm probably a little bit closer to overwhelm. And emotionally, I'm still on fear, but, in action, I'm moving towards growth. And so, if I look at my body, I guess this is just emphasizing how many points it takes to map out a given area. If I look at my body, I'd say we got some tension around the eyes, some tension in the neck, and some tension in the low back, and my calves. So that seems to be where things are held up a little bit in terms of the holding and flowing. And then there's also a part that's kind of childlike, that I want someone else to be responsible for my life and make my decision. And so this gives me a sense of what's going on. Now, what's the part that's core around all of this? That stays constant with me in all kinds of areas. So one is a lot of clarity. Jen and I have worked out a clear agreement in writing about the whole choice around the car, that to make sure that it's something that's a win-win and that we understand what that win is for both of us. So that's that's part of the core there. Then there's also a worst-case scenario tightness, like what could go wrong, and so that part of me generally has backup scenarios. It's one of the reasons that I like the i3 more than the Tesla, is the i3 has depreciated in value by more than 70% at this point. And it's only 4 or 5 years old. And so the car is being bought with a 70% discount, which means that it's easier to sell, one. Two, I can pay cash and I don't like debt. So there's a benefit there. And so I'm looking at these worst case scenarios and responding to each of them. Like, what would happen if we had a fight about this? What would happen if the car gets totaled? And so in those areas, I usually listen to each of the concerns and then come up with a response. Well, what would happen? Well, if we need to, this could be an easy car to sell. Well, what if we needed to go on a longer trip? Well, the i3 has a range extender. So there's a lot of problem solving. So problem solving in response to worst case scenario, thinking things through, doing things really clearly. Those are types of things that I take into any situation because they bring a tremendous amount of success. Every time I do that in business or other areas, success goes up. And so that's common. And so, and then, things around the loan. The benefit of getting the loan is I have more cash reserves. The benefit of paying all cash is there's no debt, which I like. And then there's the thought, well, what's the worst case scenario? What if I need that cash? Well, in that situation, I can always get a loan after I've paid cash for it, if that makes sense. Get a loan based. So that's a retroactive process that's possible. And so, there's the answer. And so that's me around this. Now, what isn't on here that I can now focus on now that this is laid out this way? Well, I think one of the biggest things that's not on here is I don't have a sense that I know my wife with her own car. And because we've never, she's just learning to drive, we've never experienced that. She's never experienced that. And she's not very communicative around, like, how might that affect things positively and negatively for our relationship? What are their expectations? For example, we're talking about her getting a job. Would that help? What will happen there? And so I think there's some fear of just not knowing that area well. And so that's, I would say, where the biggest tightness comes out. And in this dynamic where I would be doing a loan to my wife, we keep our finances pretty separately. I would be doing a loan. Does that introduce a tension? That kind of thing, I would say, is the number one holdup. So the number one resistance, which kind of isn't here, I'll just kind of mark it, would be there. And the number one hope would be that in this way that, as she grows into different experiences and has more independence, that I get to see her becoming more of the human being that she is and can be, and that growing and maturing will challenge our relationship in a healthy way and take us forward. And so that would be the biggest hope, and the biggest fear being the uncertainty and not really understanding how that would work. So this is my mapping around this, and there's a couple of things to do around this. So that kind of completes this demonstration. My first time using this board, my first time talking out loud about it, just picking something random that's going on today. And to understand that this map can be used around all kinds of things. In other words, now that you do this, I'm recording this dialogue, and I think that's a good idea because that creates a log around these different points. Now with a lot more pins, each of these can hold multiple colors, and so these could all be green, and then they could, and this could all be one issue, and then we could go on to another issue and place that in. And in doing so, as you go around the life with personas, there's a lot of depth in sharing. Now, I like the idea of a video recording it to bring life and possibility to understanding. I like the idea of going back and forth and having both couples, for example, doing this. I like the idea of making a business decision around some of these things. The bottom line is, whatever we're conscious of doesn't control our life. Whatever we are unconscious of is bound to continue as it began until it comes to light and an equal force or a greater force shifts us in a new direction. And so this is all about bringing consciousness in. Making a video like this, putting it on YouTube as a private video and then sharing it is pretty easy. I did the basic frame with these liquid chalk markers. These are $10. This is $30 on Amazon. And fish string is whatever it is, and just a camera with a front-facing phone allows it to be recorded. my ultimate dream is to participate through my nonprofit Happiness Data in an app that would do all of this with push buttons, and where you can, put in percentages and intensities and link it over time, so that we can build a dialogue with all of our main personas. Look at the personas that are helping our life grow, the personas that are collapsing us. For example, when we're in a bar, the persona that we become in a bar may constantly undermine the persona that's taking our life in a positive direction, say in a healthy relationship. And so you can see the tension then in this wheel, where there's always a persona on the other side. There's the hard work, discipline persona, and then there's the play persona on the opposite side that doesn't want to, the childlike innocence that doesn't want any responsibility and just wants to be spontaneous and play. And they have to dialogue. They're all contained within the self. And so I think it would be great to track this over time in an app that is designed to facilitate self-awareness and bring that outwards. This ties in with another idea that I have, which is when people are working towards mental, emotional, and physical health, they often, at least I've worked with a number of practitioners who don't communicate with one another. And so one of my dreams would be to have this happen online, and if I was working with a therapist, have them have access to a video, to chart data, and when you've got slider bars, etc., trends can emerge that can then be discussed with a healer, a coach, a therapist, where you'd say, well, it seems like, as you're moving over the last 3 months, your emotions are generally descending from predominantly expansive emotions like joy and enthusiasm into fear and terror and helplessness, etc. And what's that trend, and how does it correlate with the outside environment? Seems like you were feeling very mature, but now that you've lost your job, now it seems like you're relating to life primarily as a 6-year-old. A lot of your personas are afraid of being punished, afraid of being judged for not having money in a materialistic culture. So these types of things can be tracked for the purpose of understanding. Because once you have it out there, then you can assess and engage with it. And you can say, okay, well, I understand that my 3-year-old is nervous about this, and yet it's what I need to focus on is what does my 45-year-old think. So the real kind of meta about all of this is, one, that there's a mental intelligence that's different than the body intelligence. And so when you put, whether it's tapping on a phone or putting a magnet on a particular area, there were times, for example, when my mind thought I would be putting it here, but when I go with my body, it's like, I'm putting it there. And then I can learn from my body and then say, yeah, you're right, there is something there that I wasn't noticing with my mind. And simultaneously, it's bringing in a lot of mental things as well. So most of us don't have anything like this in our life. The good news is it's about $50 away, $30 for the chalkboard, $20 in magnets for chalkboards. I like the colors, as I say, because that allows multiple topics can be done in different colors. A camera or a therapeutic interaction, or we could have a decision like this. Imagine if my wife was sitting here, and after I got done placing all my magnets, she had her own colors, and placed all of her magnets, and then we saw where we were together and where we were apart. I personally place a very high value on that, the sense of knowing and being known. And so this is something that occurred to me a few days ago. I bought the white markers and the magnets. This is the first demonstration. If you do something like this and want to share it, I'd love to hear what your system is. I also want to say that this can be done at a much smaller scale on paper with writing, or it could be broken up into a notebook. But I like the format of not having to write all this out every time and just place magnets. And if I wasn't presenting this to you, this process, and if I had done it a few more times, would go very quick. And I might leave it there, like this is my issue, and work with it. You know, maybe do a dream about it, a meditation about it, think about it, what's going on here, and just notice how to move this towards intelligence. Because ultimately, that's the goal with self-awareness, to make a decision that more consciously and effectively leads to more well-being per unit of energy invested. A decision that more consciously and effectively leads to more well-being per unit of energy invested. And so that, that being the goal, this is one of many tools.